Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pearce. This is a Ukraine war frontline update for the, oh my goodness, it's just turned the 17th of November 2024. Midnight has struck. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the screen, pause the video and look at the legend. Legend jokes apply here. Okay. We'll go to the north first, as ever. We'll start up in Kursk. And as you can see, there are a number of different pin colours on the map at the moment. Most of them are of the Russian variety, meaning that both mappers agree that the Russians have made some significant gains right across the front lines. Not unusual for the stage of the war at the moment, where the Russians really are pressuring the Ukrainians. As you can see here, Surat Maps has the Russians making gains in a number of areas, although the Ukraine is also making some gains in that northwestern segment. So interesting that the Ukrainians have some success over here in this wooded area to the northeast of the Kursk sector. And the Russians gaining, trying to close off the Ukrainians here and cut them off northwest of Novoivanivka there, where we have seen an awful lot of activity around here. The Russians have been throwing in wave after wave after wave of mechanized assaults, and the Ukrainians done a really good job of repelling those attacks, but the Russians trying to come down from the north to Malaya Lochnia and moving eastwards from Novoivanivka to cut this whole area of Ukrainian control off here. As you can see, Andrew Perpetua doesn't have any change to the map in this whole sector over the last couple of days, but Surat Maps showing that claiming that the Russians are making some progress coming south towards Malaya Lochnia and a little bit towards the west here, possibly this part. I'm not sure what the automated mapping has done there. I think it could signify that this whole area is actually newly taken by the Russians. But interesting over here. I hope that the Ukrainians aren't cut off there and surrounded. Some gains as well around Plakovo here, with the Russians moving south of Plakovo, according again to Surat Maps, and north of Plakovo around the Cherkasskaya Konopelka area there. So the Russians having some success in pushing the Ukrainians back in the whole Kursk area, but it is a mixed bag of nuts up in that northwestern area there. If we have a look at Euromaidan press, they say that the frontline report here, the Russians, and this, they normally almost transcribe what reporting from Ukraine, the YouTube channel, says on a daily basis. So this will be based on reporting from Ukraine. Russians launch a third counter-offensive wave and repeat the failed tactics 6 times. They keep doing the same thing. They've done that throughout the war, right, which is beat their heads against a brick wall, except it's not quite that, because they do make these territorial gains. So they just throw infantry and throw mechanized assaults one after the other. Even if they get repelled, they keep going until eventually they wear down the Ukrainians, or the Ukrainian ability to repel those attacks. So the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade attempted a river crossing, left both banks littered with destroyed vehicles and casualties, they say there. So that is actually somewhere else, because we have heard. So this is talking about Zelenya, where is it, Shilak, which is on this western side of the. I'm gonna have to find that again, because we did see quite a lot of activity around there some weeks ago. Yeah, so that was right where we were looking, around the Novoivanivka area, just southwest of Novoivanivka. You've got Zelenyi Shilak. This was an area where the Russians executed some Ukrainian prisoners of war a couple of weeks back. But anyway, activity there concerning crossing of a river somewhere around this area. But it's interesting, there was the report of the Russians crossing a river somewhere around Plakovo, I think it was, around here, where they got absolutely hammered, and they made it to a river. I don't know if they made it as far west as somewhere around here, or whether it was elsewhere around here, maybe up around this neck of the woods. Can't quite remember exactly where it was, but they crossed a river on. It was here. It was the Sel River. So it was somewhere along here, probably around here, that the Russians crossed on boats and got hammered, as in 100% of the Russians perished in that attack. Not a single person survived. There's another attack over here involving trying to cross a river, as according to reporting from Ukraine and Euromaidan press, saying that the 810th, who have had a bit of a harsh time of it over the last week or so, they've lost an awful lot of equipment and personnel there, but they attempted a river crossing and left both banks littered with destroyed vehicles and casualties. So not looking good there for the Russians, but they do manage to maintain these gains, and they are putting the Ukrainians under an awful lot of pressure there. Right, we are going to actually come to the northern border, further to the west from the Kursk Oblast, where the troops have crossed, Russian troops, sorry, have crossed into the border northwest of Kharkiv here at a place called I'm going to give this a good try, Sotnizhiki Kozachok. We have Surat maps talking about this, where the situation on the northern front from Bohodukhiv axis, the Russian army crossed the border and entered again in the locality of that place there. So let's go and put that on the map, and that is going to be, let's try and pronounce that again. But it's this area just to the west of the two Kharkiv sectors where the Russians have been active over the last couple of months. It's this area where, as you can see, Surat Maps has it marked out as Russian control in Sotnitsky Kozachok. There you go. That was easier that time with a slightly different transcription. But it appears that the Russians have opened up another area of attack there. Not for the first time, though. They have attacked there previously, but that's worrying for the Ukrainians, certainly. Right, not pinned, though, so I don't know quite why that is, but basically that's another area where the Russians have made gains. Right, we're going to come further to the east now, to the northeastern axis, and we're going to start up in Kupyansk area, Kupyansk-Svatove-Kreminna. And in the Kupyansk area, the Russians have got into Kupyansk. I talked about this the other day. They have had these attacks into Kupyansk, right into the urban area of it. But Kupyansk itself is kind of split by the river, the Oskil River that comes down. And the main part of Kupyansk appears to be on the western side of the river. We're talking about this area to the eastern side of the river. This is a real worry, though. Ukrainians have been under a lot of pressure up in this northeast, right across that whole front line, actually, over the last month or so. And the Russians appear to be having the better of it compared to the Ukrainians. Here, Surat Map says the fighting between the Russian army and Ukrainians took place at the sugar plant, the dairy canning plant, and the metal receiving plant, Iskra. Russian forces consolidated new forests north of the city and in the streets of Sosnova and Dostoyevskoho, and the fodder plant. So all of those random places that I'm not too aware of, but they are detailed here on that eastern side of the Oskil River as it comes down there. So you've got a sugar plant, a dairy canning plant, metal receiving plant, fodder plant, and some other energy facility there. And just remember that each of these places are part of the infrastructure of certainly this local area. That's going to be economy, the local economy will be dependent on it. There's probably energy coming from this facility there. So all of this being taken by the Russians is going to hurt the Ukrainians in different ways. But yeah, not looking good for the Ukrainians there, as the Russians coming down through the forest area from Liman Pershi towards that eastern part of Kupyansk. And then Andrew Perpetua agreeing that a large area of this Pischany salient, where the Russians have pushed towards the Oskil River further south from Kupyansk. A lot of this area is actually under Russian control. So it's not necessarily a change from the last 2 days of the Russians attacking there, but just the evidence to support what Surat maps have previously said. Likewise, similar down around Vishnevy there on the way towards Persho-Travnevy. That's the Persho-Travnevy here, not the one further up north around, where is it? There. That one there. So as it's Ukraine, there are similarly named places all over the shop. So the Ukrainians being pressured all over this northeastern axis. So here we have some gains for the Russians around Ryarodka, and then also further down south near Novovodyanye, and the Russians pushing a little bit to the west of Karmazinivka there. Tough times for the Ukrainians, but good to see that the Terny and Torska area has been a little bit more stable over the last few days. That's where the Russians were pressuring an awful lot previously. Now, interesting that Surat Maps has adapted or changed the mapping around here, around the Nokomianska and around Bilahorivka. I saw a report, I'll be sharing it with you tomorrow in my, I think, Hits and Losses video, where there have been some complaints that, in fact, there have been a couple of sackings of Russian commanders in the 3rd Combined Arms Army as a result of them lying up the command structures. We've talked a lot about Vranyo, about, you know, lying to your bosses. Your bosses know that, and then they pass that lie on. But at some point, there's a reality check, and it either gets to someone who does believe it and they make really poor decisions, or somebody realizes that there's bullshit going on and they end up going, hang on, that's not good, and someone's heads for the chopping block. So for the 3rd Combined Arms Army, there have been a number of people who have been arrested, sacked, court-martialed or whatever, I think arrested actually, on account of lying to their superiors, saying that they control villages and towns that they do not control. So when we see a vast difference between the two mappers here, and I know quite often Surat Maps will make claims that the Russians have got to point X, and then some days later, Andrew Perpetua can often agree that actually the Russians have got there, but he's a little bit more conservative. It takes a lot more evidence to convince him of that. But there are a number of times where actually Andrew doesn't end up agreeing with Surat Maps. Here's an example where there's been this difference around Bilahorivka for ages. And in fact, I think it's one of this area where this has been given as an example of lying, that actually the Russians haven't taken Bilahorivka. I'm sure it's that. We'll look at it tomorrow. But it could well be that here you have an example where the Russians have claimed, or certain commanders have claimed to have taken territory up to certain lines, and then they get found out to have been lying, and then they end up getting in trouble. But those initial lies turn into the Russian MOD making claims, mapping claims, and then Surat Maps, as a very pro-Russian, believe everything the MOD says kind of mapper, maps those changes, and there are these differences that can last for an awful long time. Now, interestingly, there are also differences that last a long time, and then Andrew does end up making changes. And actually, that's just happened around Klishchivka and Ivanivska and this area to the south and southwest of Bakhmut. So finally, I've been saying for a long time, there are these huge differences. And finally, it has come to pass that actually the Russians do control at least some of that land there. So there is an example where it's not always that Surat Maps has got it wrong and the MOD have it wrong. Anyway, just to show you that, yep, there are some blue pins there, and that's good for the Ukrainians. Coming further along the Siversk front and the northern Bakhmut, north of Soledar here, the Russians controlling a little bit more land around Saku-Vanseti, if you remember that tiny village on that river there, around Krasnopolivka and Rozdilivka as well. So Russians making some small gains there. Now, There have been claims of huge attacks into Chasiv Yar. Andrew Perpetua talked about it on his live stream a couple of nights ago. He said that the Russians led a massive attack into Chasiv Yar. We don't know, I don't know fully what has happened there. Surat Maps has made some small changes here, but actually that small change is fairly significant, given that this is a really important place. I think it's a case of fighting here rather than fighting back on this crescent of much more significant towns and cities like Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, and indeed we can talk about Siversk over there, a lot closer to the front line. But it's really important that the Ukrainians hold on to Chasiv Yar as long as they have. Now, the Russians were supposed to have taken that by the end of summer, and that failed. We are now into winter, and they are still not even halfway through Chasiv Yar, but it looks like they're really trying it on. They're trying it on everywhere along the front lines. They're throwing everything they can at the Ukrainians, including, you know, people who have only signed a contract 12 days previously, as we heard this morning in my hits and losses video, where you've got a guy that signed up 12 days before dying on the front line, being sent into his first attack. 3 days of those 12 were spent traveling. So you've got basically a week training and then sent to the front line, and then you die. The point being that the Russians are attacking everywhere along the front line, but they are throwing everything at the Ukrainians. Like, it appears like they are throwing everything they possibly can. Because, you know, it's now or never. This is the perfect time for the Russians to attack before they're forced to a negotiation potentially. They want to take as much of a bite of the apple as they possibly can. The Ukrainians in a bit of an interesting situation where they've got different units training abroad and places like the Kyiv unit, 4,500 troops, well, 2,500 I think, combat troops and other support units and whatnot, trained by part of the 155th, trained by the French. They've now finished training. They're on the way back to Ukraine. It's going to be fascinating to see where they are sent. Are they sent into just defending, or are they utilizing Kursk, or can they open up another front to keep the Russians really on their toes? Anyway, going back to Chasiv Yar, as you can see, some I guess, agreement from Andrew Perpetua as to who controls what. So I wouldn't necessarily say those are gains made in the last few days. This one is in the middle of Chasiv Yar, if Surat Maps is correct. And also further down around Kursk, as, I mean, this doesn't surprise me. It just amazes me it's taken so long. You would expect the Russians to have taken all the way up to the canal, going from basically Mayorska down here. So the canal comes up here, and then skirts along, basically it acts as a front line for the Russian troops right up into Chasiv Yar. That the Russians have still not taken up to the Donbass Canal there in this area around Andrivka and south of Klishivka is quite amazing for me. The Ukrainians have obviously done a pretty good job of keeping them at bay, but Surat Maps showing that around Kursk, the Russians have supposedly made some gains. Right, then we come down to Toretsk and New York. Now, this is interesting because this has been an area where the Russians have been held at bay for quite a few days, or well, probably a week or so. The Ukrainians have seemed to have had some success in keeping the Russians in check, but there were some massive attacks by the Russians here over the last few days. Now, according to Surat Maps, they've taken some land in the north of Toretsk, between Druzhba and Toretsk center. But there's a right mixed bag of nuts going on here. Ignore those three there. I think those are random glitches of pins. Let's explain. Okay, first of all, let's come down to this area of New York, where the Russians have been pushing north through New York. According to Surat Maps, taken some fields north of New York. However, Surat Maps has probably rejigged the mapping. I don't know that this is the Ukrainians attacking in the last day. This is more likely that the Russians never really got that far. As you can see, there's a massive difference between Surat Maps and Andrew Perpetua. Andrew Perpetua's lines of Russian defense are here, which means that this is where the Russians are consolidated. They can supply their troops up to here. Anywhere north of there, as far as Andrew's concerned, is a grey zone where they'll be attacking. No one really controls it. The Ukrainians might be attacking. It might be quite dynamic. However, Surat Maps claims that this is all controlled by the Russians, and in fact, they controlled right up into here. I just don't think that was correct, and so these blue pins might not be a counterattack. It might just be an admission that actually the initial mapping was overzealous. It could be the case around here as well in the south of Toretsk. But Andrew Perpetua's also shown that the Russians have been pushed back or do not control as much of the center of Toretsk as was initially thought. And in fact, that's quite a significant move there. So if you draw an imaginary line between these light blue pins, that's where Andrew Perpetua's lines previously were. They're now all the way back here. So actually, potentially good news for the Ukrainians there, although Surat Maps thinks that the Russians have gained some in that general area. So I suppose the end result of all of this is it's dynamic, it's chaotic. Who knows exactly what building and what street each side firmly controls, but the Russians are pressuring there again. But the Ukrainians might also be countering too. No change to the northern part of Pokrovsk, and this area, it appears that that's where the major fortifications are. Trench line for the Ukrainians coming down there. The Russians have made some gains though along this railway line as it goes towards Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk. Sorry, actually Mirnohrad's much further to north. Pokrovsk there, basically towards the south of Pokrovsk. This is all very, very worrying. If we zoom out, you can see just how much the Russians are advancing all along this front, and that is both mappers largely agreeing that there are advances. It might be that Andrew lags behind Surat Maps, who's quite enthusiastic about Russian gains. But essentially, the Russians are gaining all around here. It's not good news anywhere around there, and it's highly likely that the Russians are really going to equalize this whole front line all the way down there. I mean, I could go into lots of detail about these sort of places. Andrew Perpetua talked a lot about this general area the other day in his live stream. Go and check that out, and here too. It's really unlikely that the Ukrainians are going to be holding out anywhere around here for much longer. I would imagine that the Russians are going to be filling all of this area in. Although one must think that the Russians are throwing, as I've mentioned, everything at the Ukrainians. In fact, I've just watched a bit of footage. That was an entire attack done on basically golf carts, golf buggies. There's not a single... I wonder if it's... No, not there. Yeah, so here Russian forces seemingly advance deep into Chasiv and clamber under a building. I meant to show you this earlier. Let's go and put that in. Sorry to flip around on the map here, but I did mean to show you that. Let's go and give that a search. See where that is. Interesting. Okay, so yeah, that's why you've got that that movement on the map for Surat Maps. That there's a flag that has been placed. You need to be careful of flags. It don't always mean that it's robustly controlled by any side. They can either drop them by drones, but also just run in, pin up a flag, and actually rush out again. And it's more of a PR stunt. So that is something to bear in mind. But the Russians are massively attacking in Chasiv Yar, so it's likely that they have made those sorts of gains. But coming back down to here, yeah, I did see. Let's go and see if I can find that on my Twitter feed, because it's fascinating to think that the Russians are, second greatest army in the world, and they've attrited their mechanized equipment to the point where they are really struggling. Here it is. It's this one. Yes, it's this one. FPV drones operated by SBU. I'm going to have to pause it. SBU Unit Alpha strike deep into Russian rear positions. The extended range of tactical UAVs is now a game changer. As Russian forces avoid bringing large transports to the front line, precise hits on logistics can halt their assaults by disrupting supply chains. But what Null Reports doesn't mention here, as other people have, it's that same video, is that these are all entirely golf buggies and non kind of infantry fighting vehicles and tanks. The entire Russian assault group here, so this is Special Kherson Cat said of the same video, the entire Russian assault group uses exclusively light unarmored civilian vehicles. I think I've never seen anything like this before. So we're still at this point where it's like the Russians are just throwing everything. How long can they keep this going? But the Ukrainians are also in desperate straits themselves, where they really need reinforcements. They are probably low on morale, but certainly low on boots on the ground here. And while they might have an improved situation with artillery ammunition and weapons in general, it's the boots on the ground that they need. And this is what is facilitating the Russians advancing all across these vast areas of the front line. And they can do that just by having people they've picked up in the last couple of weeks who have very limited training. Just whack a gun on their back and tell them to run for it, and then they can stick flags around all these places. And the Ukrainians are giving up some really important defensive areas. So Andrew Perpetua was bemoaning the idea that Russians are making these gains around Daunya. This is really good Ukrainian defensive area here, where they've got decent fortifications, and the Russians are overcoming those fortifications, and the Ukrainians appear to be unable to do much about it, and that's a real shame. I mean, you can see the huge amounts of gains that the Russians are making right across this entire region, and that goes further to the west as well, north of the kind of Vuhledar area. Now that I can't even see where Vuhledar was. It's probably there's Vuhledar all the way back there. So now we're going towards Velika Novosilka, which is my goodness, this is it. So Velika Novosilka's there. This is Uruzhany, Staromyorska, Staromilnivka. All of these areas that the Russians and Ukrainians were fighting over such a long time. The Russians are just kind of moving through all these fields, all these villages, and joining everything up from the east as well, and then starting to make gains around Marfapil and further to the west. Dorozhnyanka as well, places that we've heard previously, getting dangerously close to Hyliopole, which is, a fairly significant settlement, bit of a logistics hub, or at least would have been previously before it was that close to the front line. And then around Robotno as well, according, again, all of this is Surat maps, but it appears that the Russians are having success right across the front line, and those pins tell a story. Challenging times for the Ukrainians, while the Russians themselves are not in the strongest of positions in terms of their economy, their mobilization efforts, their training, their equipment, their own boots on the ground. So both sides really struggling, but the Russians just throwing caution to the wind and going for it, I think, across the front line. That's my interpretation of events, of course. Take it with a pinch of salt. Anyway, hopefully that's of use. Thank you very much for putting up my waffling, and I'll speak to you at some point tomorrow.